My beloved child, something shifted yesterday in a way no one expected, and the most surprising part was not the argument, the silence, or even the tears that followed it was the realization that arrived when everything became quiet. She had spent so much time believing she understood where she stood with him, believing that every conversation, every moment of attention, every small promise meant a new chapter was beginning, but yesterday one detail refused to stay hidden any longer. His heart kept returning to you. Not dramatically, not through some grand confession, but through the little things he could no longer disguise. The way his expression changed when your name entered the conversation. The way he became distant whenever she tried to speak about a future together. The way certain memories seemed to pull him somewhere she could not follow. And suddenly, what she had been trying not to see became impossible to ignore. She began to wonder whether he had ever truly been moving toward her, or whether he had simply been running away from what he still felt for you. Don't skip, because the deepest part of this story is not what she discovered about him. It is what she discovered about herself the moment she understood why nothing between them ever felt completely secure. There had always been an invisible hesitation in him, a pause she could sense but could never explain. She had tried to fill that pause with more attention, more conversations, more reassurance, thinking perhaps time would eventually make him fully present. But yesterday, she finally understood that you cannot force someone to forget a connection simply by standing closer to them. And that realization hurt her pride more than anything else. Yet beneath that hurt was another feeling she had not expected: embarrassment. She began replaying moments she once considered proof that he had chosen her, and now those same moments looked different. That late-night conversation where he seemed distracted. That time she asked if he was completely over the past and he answered too quickly. That strange silence when someone casually mentioned you. Small moments that once appeared meaningless were suddenly connecting themselves into a picture she could no longer dismiss. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of asking herself why he still cared about you, she began asking why she had ignored the signs for so long. And that question changed the emotional direction of everything. Because sometimes anger does not begin when someone learns the truth. It begins when they realize a part of them already knew. Stay till the end, because what followed was quieter than revenge usually looks. She did not immediately make some dramatic move. She did not suddenly have a perfect plan. She simply became still. And in that stillness, resentment started forming around the idea that she had been treated like a temporary escape from feelings he never truly resolved. She began thinking, was I ever really being chosen, or was I simply helping him avoid missing someone else? That thought became impossible to shake. But here is where the story becomes more complicated, because his behavior yesterday did not look like someone celebrating the collapse of another connection. He looked unsettled too. Perhaps for the first time, he was being forced to confront what distraction had allowed him to postpone. You. Not an idealized version of you. Not a memory polished by distance. You as the person whose absence had remained louder than he wanted to admit. And while she was beginning to feel used, he was beginning to recognize that replacing a connection is not the same as healing from it. There is a difference between moving forward and simply moving away, and yesterday that difference became painfully clear. Something important is waiting for you here, because the third party's frustration was not really created by your presence. It was created by the truth that your absence had never fully removed you from his emotional world. She could compete with attention. She could compete with time. She could even compete with memories for a while. But she could not compete with something he had never honestly faced. And once she understood that, her sadness began turning into determination. Not necessarily determination to hurt anyone, but determination to regain control of a situation in which she suddenly felt powerless. She wanted answers. She wanted him to explain every moment that now seemed questionable. She wanted to know whether she had been building something real or standing inside a story that was never truly hers. And somewhere inside that emotional confusion, another thought appeared: perhaps if you were removed from the picture completely, he would finally become emotionally available to her. But even she could sense the flaw in that idea. Because you had already been physically absent from many of the moments she shared with him, and still his heart had found its way back toward you. That is what disturbed her most. The problem was never simply your presence. The problem was the meaning you still carried. And then came the moment that changed everything. She asked him a question she had apparently been afraid to ask directly before. It was simple. Almost too simple. She wanted to know whether, if you reached out tomorrow and asked for an honest conversation, he would ignore you. There was no dramatic speech. No instant declaration. Just a pause. But sometimes a pause answers the question before words ever arrive. She saw it. He knew she saw it. And suddenly the room felt different. Because in that hesitation was everything she had been trying not to understand. He could not promise that he would turn away from you. Not because he had already decided what the future would be, but because somewhere inside him there were still things left unsaid, feelings left unresolved, and questions he had never stopped carrying. That was the moment her composure finally began to crack. Not because you had done anything to her. Not because you had interfered. But because she realized she might have been standing beside someone whose heart had never completely arrived. And yet, my beloved child, there is another layer she does not fully understand yet. His lingering feelings are not automatically a promise of reunion, and they do not guarantee what happens next. What they reveal is simply that avoidance did not erase what needed to be faced. And that matters, because the next step will not be decided by jealousy, competition, or revenge. It will be decided by honesty. The kind of honesty that asks difficult questions without forcing answers. The kind that allows someone to admit, I tried to move on before I understood what I was moving on from. She may still want to interfere. She may still want to prove that she mattered more than she now fears she did. She may even try to reshape the story so she does not feel like the person who was temporarily standing in the middle of something unfinished. But there is something she cannot control, what he finally chooses to admit to himself. And yesterday, that private admission began. He started looking back differently. He remembered conversations with you that he once dismissed as ordinary and realized how deeply they had stayed with him. He remembered your patience in moments he did not fully appreciate. He remembered the way you could read his silence without demanding that he explain everything immediately. And perhaps most importantly, he recognized that when he tried to forget you by becoming emotionally occupied elsewhere, he did not actually erase the connection. He simply covered it. For a while. Then the cover slipped. That is why yesterday mattered. Not because someone lost and someone else won. Love is not a contest with a scoreboard. Yesterday mattered because pretending became harder than telling the truth. And somewhere between her realization and his silence, the entire emotional balance shifted. She now knows there is a part of his heart she never truly reached. He now knows distraction cannot decide his future for him. And you may soon understand why certain things remained unresolved even when everything appeared to be over. But there is still one detail from yesterday that neither of them expected, and it came after the conversation was supposedly finished. He picked up his phone, stared at something connected to you for longer than he meant to, and what he did next may explain why the third party suddenly believes she is running out of time. The screen in his hand became the one thing he could not look away from, because what appeared there was not dramatic at all, it was familiar. A photograph. An old message. A small reminder of a moment that had once seemed ordinary but suddenly carried a completely different weight. And while the third party believed the conversation between them had ended, something inside him was only beginning to open. He did not reach for his phone because he wanted to create another problem. He reached for it almost automatically, as if his mind had finally stopped fighting the place his heart kept returning to. For several quiet seconds, he simply stared. Then he scrolled upward. One message became another. A sentence you had written long ago led him to another memory, and another, until he was looking at pieces of a connection he had spent so much energy trying to place behind him. But this time, he was not reading those words with frustration. He was reading them with understanding. Something had changed in the way he saw the past. The things he once considered complicated now seemed strangely simple. You had wanted clarity. You had wanted honesty. Perhaps you had wanted him to meet you emotionally in a place he was not ready to enter then. And suddenly he began wondering whether he had confused your depth with difficulty simply because depth required something from him that distraction never did. Don't skip, because the third party noticed what was happening before he realized she was watching. She had expected him to be thinking about their disagreement. She had expected him to follow her, reassure her, perhaps tell her she had misunderstood everything. Instead, she saw the softened expression on his face as he looked at something on that screen, and she knew without asking whose presence had entered the room again. Yours. Not physically. Not through a phone call. Simply through memory. And that somehow made the realization even stronger. She had believed that if you were not actively present, you could eventually become irrelevant. But there he was, surrounded by the aftermath of an argument about moving forward, voluntarily looking backward toward you. Her first reaction was not anger. It was disbelief. She watched him for a few seconds, trying to convince herself there could be another explanation. But then something happened that removed almost every doubt. He smiled. Barely. It was not the smile of someone celebrating. It was softer than that, almost painful in its tenderness. The kind of smile people make when they remember a version of themselves they did not understand until much later. She had seen him laugh many times, but this expression was different. It contained history. It contained regret. And perhaps most threatening to her sense of security, it contained affection he was no longer pretending had disappeared. She asked him what he was looking at. He locked the screen. Too late. The answer had already crossed his face. And that tiny movement closing the phone instead of showing her created another question she could not ignore. Why protect something if it meant nothing? He tried to explain that he was simply thinking. But thinking about what? Thinking about whom? She wanted specifics, and this time he seemed exhausted by avoiding them. There are moments when a person becomes tired of defending a story they no longer believe themselves, and yesterday he reached one of those moments. He did not give her a cruel answer. He did not disrespect what they had shared. He simply admitted that certain feelings connected to you had never been fully resolved. Those words were quiet. Yet they changed everything. Because she had spent so long believing she was competing against the past, and suddenly she understood that the past was still emotionally present. Stay till the end, because what she said next revealed something neither of them had been willing to discuss before. She asked, "Then what am I to you?" And for the first time, he did not immediately know how to answer. That hesitation broke something inside her, not because he intentionally wanted to hurt her, but because certainty was the one thing she desperately needed, and certainty was exactly what he could not give. He tried to explain that she mattered. He told her the time they shared was real. But real does not always mean permanent, and meaningful does not always mean meant to continue. She heard the uncertainty beneath his words. She sensed that somewhere along the way she had mistaken emotional closeness for emotional arrival. And slowly, the deeper truth emerged: he had entered that connection while still carrying unfinished feelings about you. Perhaps he genuinely believed he could begin again. Perhaps he convinced himself that enough new experiences would eventually quiet the old ones. But relationships are not erasers. New memories do not automatically delete the significance of old ones. Sometimes they simply exist beside them until one moment forces a person to decide what each connection truly means. Yesterday was that moment. And strangely, while she felt herself losing control of the situation, he felt something else entirely. Relief. Not happiness. Relief. Because admitting the truth meant he no longer had to perform certainty he did not feel. He could finally acknowledge that he missed parts of what existed between you. He missed the emotional familiarity. He missed the way certain conversations with you reached places in him that ordinary conversation never touched. He missed being understood without constantly explaining himself. And the more honestly he looked at those feelings, the more he realized something uncomfortable: he had not chosen someone else because his feelings for you disappeared. He had chosen movement because standing still with those feelings had become difficult. There is a difference. A very important difference. Something important is waiting for you here, because this realization did not immediately send him running toward you. In fact, it made him more careful. He suddenly understood that if he ever approached you again, he could not arrive with the same confusion he carried before. He could not expect you to reopen your heart simply because he had finally become honest with his own. He would need to understand what went wrong, what he contributed to the distance, and whether he was genuinely prepared to communicate differently. This is where the story becomes more grounded than the third party realizes. She is imagining a competition. He is beginning to think about responsibility. She is wondering how to prevent him from returning emotionally to you. He is wondering whether he ever truly left emotionally in the first place. Those are completely different questions. And because she does not yet understand that difference, her frustration is growing. She began thinking about ways to remind him of everything they shared. Places they had gone. Plans they had discussed. Conversations that made her believe something permanent was developing. She brought up moments she knew were meaningful to him, almost as if emotional evidence could convince him to choose a particular future. He listened. He did not deny those memories. But something in his response frightened her even more than rejection would have. He told her that appreciating what happened between them did not mean pretending he was certain about what came next. That sentence changed her expression immediately. She had been waiting for him to say, "Forget what I said. I choose this." Instead, he was becoming more honest, and honesty was leading him away from promises he could not confidently make. She began to feel that the more she pushed for certainty, the more clearly he recognized his uncertainty. So she stopped talking for a moment. The room settled into a strange silence. Then she asked the question she had been circling around since everything started: "If you could speak to her right now, what would you say?" He looked down. And what happened next surprised even him, because the answer came immediately in his mind. He knew exactly what he wanted to say to you. Not a dramatic declaration. Not a perfect apology crafted to guarantee forgiveness. Something much simpler. He wanted to tell you that he finally understood something you had once tried to explain. He wanted to tell you that distance had given him perspective that closeness never could. He wanted to say that there were moments he now remembered differently. And above everything, he wanted to ask one question: did you ever feel like he was running away when all you wanted was for him to stay emotionally present? That question had been following him quietly for longer than he admitted. Yesterday it became impossible to escape. The third party could see the answer forming behind his eyes even though he did not say it aloud. And that was when her sadness began transforming into something more restless. She realized this was no longer about whether he remembered you. He was beginning to reinterpret the entire history between you. Memories that once helped him justify leaving were now creating questions about whether he had understood you correctly at all. And when someone starts reconsidering the meaning of the past, the future can suddenly feel much less predictable. She wanted to interrupt that process before it grew. She began reminding him why things between you had become complicated. She repeated old misunderstandings, old disagreements, old moments of distance. But instead of strengthening his reasons for staying away, something unexpected happened. He started defending you. Gently. Not everything, not every choice, but enough. Maybe that wasn't what she meant. I think I understand why she reacted that way now. I wasn't exactly easy to talk to then either. Every sentence made the third party quieter. Because this was not the version of the story she had heard before. Earlier, he had spoken about the connection as something that simply could not work. Now he was acknowledging his own role in why it did not. And when blame begins turning into understanding, emotional walls can change very quickly. Yet there is one thing you need to hear clearly: his realization does not make you responsible for comforting him, rescuing him, or reopening anything before you feel ready. His growth belongs to him. Your peace belongs to you. If an honest conversation ever happens, it should not be built on pressure, guilt, jealousy, or competition. It should be built on two people speaking with more awareness than they had before. That is what he is beginning to understand. The third party, however, is still caught in another emotional stage. She wants to know whether there is something she can do to change his mind. And somewhere beneath that desire is the revenge mentioned in this story, not revenge in some frightening or harmful sense, but an urge to regain emotional power. To make him feel the confusion she now feels. To prove she was not simply a chapter he entered while thinking about someone else. She began considering whether to tell you things. Whether to reveal conversations. Whether to make sure you saw him differently before he ever had the chance to speak for himself. But even as those thoughts appeared, another truth was beginning to slow her down. What would she really gain? If she convinced you to stay away, would that make him truly choose her, or would it only leave him with another unanswered ending? She did not like the answer. Because she was starting to realize that preventing a conversation between you could not manufacture the feelings she wanted from him. At best, it could delay the moment when he faced what was already inside him. That recognition softened something in her, even if only briefly. Perhaps her real anger was not toward you. Perhaps it was toward him for allowing her to believe he was emotionally freer than he actually was. And perhaps part of her anger was toward herself for noticing signs but accepting easier explanations. That is where her breakdown truly began. Not in jealousy. In disappointment. She had invested emotionally in a future that he had never fully promised but had allowed her to imagine. She sat down. Her voice changed. She stopped asking about you and started asking about herself. Did you ever actually see this becoming permanent? He took too long to answer. Again, the silence told the truth first. He cared. But care was not the same as certainty. And yesterday she finally stopped confusing the two. For a moment, even he seemed emotional, not because he suddenly wanted everything back the way it was, but because he understood he had contributed to her pain by avoiding clarity. He apologized. Not dramatically. Simply. He told her she deserved someone who was not trying to understand another relationship while standing inside one with her. And those words may have been the most honest thing he had given her. She looked at him differently after that. Hurt remained, but beneath it something almost like understanding appeared. Then, just as the conversation seemed to be reaching its natural ending, his phone lit up again. Neither of them touched it immediately. The notification sat there between them like a small unanswered question. And when he finally looked at the screen, his entire expression changed. It was not a message from you. It was something connected to you that he had completely forgotten existed, something that brought back the exact moment when everything between you first began to fall apart. And what he remembered next may be the reason he is no longer asking whether he misses you. He is beginning to ask whether he made the biggest emotional misunderstanding of the entire connection.